Hey everyone. What if I told you that a simple mirror repair job would lead me to discover a decades-old mystery hidden in plain sight, bring together an entire neighborhood, and completely change how I see second chances in life? If you love stories where ordinary moments reveal extraordinary truths, and where helping someone fix something broken ends up healing more than anyone expected, then you're in the right place. This is the story of how replacing a cracked mirror became a journey of self-discovery, community secrets, and finding beauty in the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Marcus Rivera, and at 39, I never imagined that my life would take such a dramatic turn. Just 8 months ago, I was managing maintenance for a chain of boutique hotels in downtown Cleveland, living in a sterile corporate apartment, and going through the motions of a marriage that had been dying slowly for years. The divorce papers were finalized in January, the hotel chain downsized in March, and by April, I found myself starting over in Millbrook Heights, with nothing but my tools, my pickup truck, and a determination to build something real from the ground up. Millbrook Heights isn't the kind of place you'd expect life-changing moments to happen. It's a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, where the biggest excitement usually comes from the annual block party, or Mrs. Henderson's elaborate Halloween decorations. Tree-lined streets with houses built in the 60s, front porches where people actually sit and wave to neighbors, and the kind of community where everyone knows when someone new moves in. I'd rented a small apartment above the garage behind the Kelly's rental house on Maple Grove Avenue, and slowly but surely, word was getting around that there was a reliable handyman in the neighborhood who actually showed up when he said he would. That's how I ended up standing on Linda Thompson's front porch last Tuesday morning, toolbox in one hand and a cup of coffee from the corner shop in the other, looking at a house that seemed to be holding its breath. The split-level home had good bones, as my grandfather used to say, but everything about it suggested transition. Half the windows had new curtains while others were bare. There were moving boxes visible through the front window, and the garden looked like someone had started enthusiastic projects and then gotten distracted by life. Linda answered the door before I could knock, almost like she'd been watching for me. She was exactly the kind of woman who commands attention without trying, the kind who probably stops conversations when she walks into a room. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun with a paintbrush stuck through it, and she wore a vintage band t-shirt covered in tiny splatters of acrylic paint. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard, green and direct, with the kind of intelligence that makes you stand up straighter without realizing it. "Marcus, right?" She extended a paint-stained hand with a firm grip. "I'm Linda. Come in. Come in." I was just finishing up a piece for my summer class. The smell of coffee and turpentine created an oddly comforting combination as I stepped inside. The living room was organized chaos, with canvases leaning against walls, books stacked on every surface, and furniture that looked like it was still finding its place after a recent move. It felt alive in a way that my old corporate apartment never had. "The mirror's upstairs in the master bedroom," she said, leading me through a hallway lined with student artwork. "I teach art at the high school, but these are from my summer community classes. Adults who always wanted to try painting, but never gave themselves permission." There was something in her voice when she said that, a note of personal understanding. That made me wonder what permissions she'd been giving herself lately. The bedroom was spacious but sparse, with morning light streaming through windows that overlooked the small backyard. Against the far wall stood what was obviously the problem. It was a magnificent piece, an antique vanity mirror with an ornate, silver frame that belonged in a classic Hollywood movie. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the light like a broken prism, and the whole thing tilted at a precarious angle that suggested the mounting hardware had given up. "My grandmother's mirror," Linda said softly, running her fingers along the undamaged portion of the frame. "It survived the Depression, 2 moves across the country, and 25 years of marriage. I'd hate for it to finally break on my watch." There was a story in her voice, layers of meaning in the way she looked at that mirror. And I found myself more curious about this woman than I'd been about anyone in a long time. I set down my toolbox and examined the mounting system. The hardware was original, probably installed sometime in the 50s, and the wall anchors had simply worn out over decades of supporting the mirror's considerable weight. The glass would need to be replaced, but the frame was solid. beautiful even under its tarnish. "This is definitely salvageable," I said, testing the stability of the frame. "The mounting system needs updating and obviously new glass, but the frame itself is in remarkable condition. You're lucky this didn't come down in the middle of the night." Linda laughed, a sound that was part relief and part something else I couldn't identify. "Luck hasn't exactly been my strong suit lately, but maybe that's changing." She perched on the edge of the bed, watching as I carefully began removing the damaged glass. "Do you mind if I ask what happened?" I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Storm damage, or just age catching up with everything?" "A little of both," she replied. "The mirror's been loose for months, but I kept putting off dealing with it. Then last week we had that crazy thunderstorm, and I woke up to find it hanging by basically one screw. Kind of like everything else in my life lately, actually." There was humor in her voice, but also a vulnerability that made me glance up from my work. That's when she said it, out of nowhere, in the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. "Do you find 50-year-old bodies attractive?" I froze, a piece of broken glass halfway to the trash bag, and looked at her with what must have been complete bewilderment. She was sitting there calmly, as if she'd asked whether I preferred coffee or tea, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the question mattered more than her casual delivery implied. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed, setting down the glass carefully because my hands had suddenly become less steady. "I'm 52, she continued matter-of-factly. "Divorced as of 3 months ago after 25 years of marriage. I haven't been. Single since I was 27, and the dating landscape has apparently changed significantly. I'm taking a poll. Do men our age find women our age attractive, or is everyone chasing 30-year-olds with perfect Instagram filters?" The question hung in the air between us like morning mist, and I realized that this wasn't really about attraction at all. This was about a woman who'd spent half her life being part of a pair, suddenly finding herself alone, and wondering if she was still visible, still valuable, still worthy of being chosen. I set down my tools completely and turned to face her. "That's quite a question for a Tuesday morning," I said, buying myself time to figure out how to respond honestly without making this awkward for both of us. "But since you're taking a poll, I'd say that anyone who doesn't appreciate a woman who can ask direct questions, teaches art to people brave enough to try new things, and keeps family heirlooms even when they're falling apart, probably isn't worth your time anyway." She smiled then, really smiled, and I saw a flash of the confidence that had probably drawn people to her long before she started questioning whether she was still worth drawing toward. "That's a diplomatic answer," she said. "But thank you. I think I needed to hear something like that today." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where an ambitious garden was struggling against an invasion of weeds. "I spent so many years being someone's wife, someone's mother when my nephew visits, someone's teacher. I'm just trying to figure out who Linda is when she's just Linda." I understood that feeling more than I could easily explain. The mirror project suddenly felt like more than a repair job, more like a metaphor for what we were both trying to do. Taking something beautiful that had been damaged, figuring out what was worth saving, and putting it back together in a way that would let it serve its purpose again. As I continued working, carefully removing each piece of broken glass and cataloging what would need to be replaced, Linda moved around the room with the restless energy of someone still getting used to having space that was entirely her own. She told me about her teaching, about the community art classes she'd started at the rec center, about her nephew Tyler who was staying with her for the summer, while his parents dealt with their own marital problems. "Tyler's 17 and thinks the whole world is stupid, but he's got a good heart underneath all that teenage attitude," she said, gathering up paintbrushes that had been scattered across the dresser. "He's documenting everything with his camera these days. Says he's making a film about authentic American stories or some such thing. I think he's just trying to avoid thinking about his parents' divorce by focusing on other people's problems." "Family complications," I said, understanding. "The impulse to lose yourself in work when personal life gets messy. Sounds familiar. My own nephew went through something similar when my sister got divorced. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be steady and present while they figure things out." "Exactly," Linda said, and I could hear the relief in her voice at being understood. "The thing is, I'm not sure I'm steady enough myself these days to be what he needs. I'm figuring out how to live alone for the first time in decades, trying to rebuild my confidence, questioning everything from my teaching methods to my taste in music. How do you help a kid navigate uncertainty when you're drowning in your own? The question felt larger than the morning, larger than the mirror repair project. And I found myself thinking about the months after my divorce, when every small decision felt monumental. What to cook for dinner when you're only feeding yourself? Which side of the bed to sleep on when both sides are empty? How to structure days when no one else's schedule depends on yours. You figure it out one piece at a time, I said, holding up a fragment of silvered glass that caught the light. Like this mirror. You don't try to fix everything at once. You remove what's broken, you save what's worth saving, you replace what needs replacing, and you put it back together with better hardware so it doesn't fall apart the same way again. Linda was quiet for a moment, watching me work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's probably the best relationship advice I've heard in months, she said finally. Better than anything my therapist has come up with, and I'm paying her $150 an hour. We both laughed, and I realized that something had shifted in the room. We'd moved past the awkwardness of her initial question into something more comfortable, more real. I was no longer just the handyman fixing her mirror, and she was no longer just the client who'd asked an unexpectedly personal question. We were two people who'd found themselves starting over, sharing the strange intimacy of honest conversation. The mounting hardware proved more challenging than I'd expected. The original installers had used toggle bolts that had worked there way loose over the decades, creating holes that were now too large for standard anchors. I'd need to patch the wall, relocate the mounting points, and probably return the next day with the new glass once the repair compound had cured. Looks like this is going to be a 2-day project, I said, gathering up the glass shards and old hardware. I can patch these holes today and come back tomorrow with new glass and proper mounting system. The frame could use some cleaning and polishing too, if you're interested. There's some beautiful detail work under all this tarnish. Linda looked pleased rather than inconvenienced by the extended timeline. Honestly, I'm in no rush. I've been avoiding looking at myself in that mirror for months anyway. Maybe by the time you're finished, I'll be ready to see whatever reflection it gives back. There was something profound in that statement. Something about readiness and self-acceptance and the courage required to really see yourself clearly. I found myself hoping that when I did get the mirror properly installed, Linda would like what she saw looking back at her. As I packed up my tools, the house suddenly filled with the sound of heavy footsteps and a door slamming. Tyler must be back from wherever 17-year-olds disappear to in suburban neighborhoods. I heard him call out a greeting to Linda, his voice carrying the particular pitch of teenage boys trying to sound casual about everything. Tyler appeared in the bedroom doorway, all elbows and camera equipment, with the kind of deliberately messy hair that takes significant effort to achieve. He was taller than I'd expected, probably 6 feet already, with Linda's intelligent eyes and the self-conscious confidence of someone still growing into his frame. "You must be the mirror guy," he said, filming our interaction with a small digital camera. "Aunt Linda told me you were coming. I'm Tyler, and this is going in my documentary about the secret lives of suburban neighborhoods. You don't mind being filmed, do you?" Linda rolled her eyes affectionately. "Tyler, you can't just film people without asking permission first. And not everyone wants to be part of your movie project." "Actually, I don't mind," I said, curious about this kid's perspective on the world. "What's the documentary about?" Tyler lowered the camera, suddenly animated. "It's about how people really live, you know? Like, everyone thinks the suburbs are boring, but there's all this hidden drama and interesting stuff happening behind closed doors. People starting over, people with secrets, people helping each other in ways that don't make the news. Real stories about real people." He had the earnest intensity that only teenagers can manage, that absolute conviction that his project was the most important thing in the world. But there was also something appealing about his desire to document authenticity, to look for the extraordinary hiding in the ordinary. "That's actually pretty cool," I said. "You planning to interview people, or just observe and film?" "Both," Tyler said, raising the camera again. "Aunt Linda's letting me document her whole starting over process, and I'm hoping to find other people in the neighborhood who have interesting stories. Like, there's this lady next door who knows everything about everyone, and there's a guy down the street who designs graphics for video games. but never talks to anybody. Everyone's got something going on beneath the surface. Linda and I exchanged a look, both of us recognizing the truth in that observation. Surface appearances rarely told the whole story, especially in neighborhoods like this where people came to build quiet lives away from the chaos of bigger cities. Tyler continued filming as I finished packing up, asking questions about the mirror repair process, and somehow making me feel like a craftsman rather than just a guy with tools. There was something refreshing about his curiosity, his assumption that everyone had something worth documenting. "So I'll see you tomorrow then," Linda said as we walked downstairs. "Same time?" "Same time," I confirmed. "I'll stop by the glass shop this afternoon and have them cut a new piece to size. Should have everything ready to install by tomorrow morning." As I loaded my tools into the truck, I found myself thinking about Linda's question and my response. The truth was, I found her attractive in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the directness of her curiosity, the vulnerability she'd shown in asking for reassurance, and the way she was clearly working to rebuild herself into someone she could respect. But more than that, I was drawn to the possibility of being part of someone's fresh start, of helping create something beautiful and functional from pieces that had been damaged. The mirror was just a mirror, but the larger project of helping Linda see herself clearly again felt like something worth investing in. Tyler waved from the front porch as I drove away, camera still rolling, and I realized that this 17-year-old had already figured out something important about life. The most interesting stories weren't the obvious ones. They were the quiet moments of human connection, the small acts of repair and rebuilding, the conversations that happened when people let their guards down long enough to be real with each other. As I headed to the glass shop to order the replacement mirror, I caught myself looking forward to tomorrow in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not just because I enjoyed the technical challenge of restoration work, but because I was curious to see what Linda Thompson would reveal about herself next, and what role I might play in helping her put the pieces back together. The afternoon, sun was warm on my face as I parked outside Miller's Glass and Mirror, and for the first time in months, the future felt full of interesting possibilities rather than just daily obligations. Sometimes the best things in life really did start with the simplest questions, even when those questions caught you completely off guard. The next morning came with the kind of crisp air that makes August feel hopeful instead of oppressive. I'd spent the evening researching the proper restoration techniques for silver-framed mirrors from the 1950s, partly because I wanted to do the job right, and partly because I couldn't stop thinking about Linda's question and what it revealed. About her state of mind. The glass shop had cut a perfect replacement piece, and I'd picked up some specialized silver polish that promised to bring out details that had been hidden under decades of oxidation. I arrived at Linda's house to find Tyler already stationed on the front porch with his camera, apparently conducting some kind of interview with Carol Martinez, the neighbor from 2 houses down. Carol was a woman who managed to look both grandmotherly and formidable at the same time, with silver hair pulled into a perfect bun and the kind of posture that suggested decades of telling people to sit up straight. She was holding a plate of what appeared to be homemade snickerdoodles and speaking with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "The neighborhood has definitely changed over the years," she was saying to Tyler's camera. "When my Harold and I moved here in 1987, every house had a family with children. Now it's mostly empty nesters and young professionals who travel too much to really put down roots. But there's still something special about this street. Something that draws people who are looking for a real sense of community." Tyler noticed me approaching and lowered the camera. "Morning, Marcus. I was just getting some background on the neighborhood for my documentary. Did you know Mrs. Martinez has lived here longer than anyone else on the block?" Carol smiled and extended the plate of cookies in my direction. "You must be the young man who's helping Linda with her mirror. I'm Carol, and these are fresh from the oven. I always make extra when I'm baking anyway. There's something about the smell of cinnamon that makes a house feel like home, don't you think?" I accepted a cookie, which was still warm and perfectly spiced, and found myself drawn into conversation despite my intention to head straight inside and get to work. Carol had the gift of making you feel like your opinion mattered. Like the simple act of sharing a cookie created a temporary but meaningful connection. "Linda tells me you're quite skilled with restoration work," Carol continued. "That mirror has been a family treasure for generations. Her grandmother brought it from Chicago when she married Linda's grandfather back in 1953. It's seen a lot of history, that mirror has. Births, celebrations, difficult goodbyes. Objects like that absorb the energy of the lives they witness. Don't you think? There was something almost mystical in the way Carol spoke about the mirror, as if she understood that this repair job was about more than just glass and hardware. Tyler seemed fascinated by her perspective, filming her words with the intensity of someone discovering treasure. "That's exactly the kind of thing I want to capture," Tyler said. "The way objects connect us to our past and help us understand who we are. Aunt Linda's been going through such a major transition, and that mirror represents so much of her family history. Getting it fixed feels symbolic somehow." Carol nodded approvingly. "Smart boy. You understand that the most important stories aren't always the obvious ones. They're in the details, the connections between things, the way people care, for what matters to them." She turned back to me with a knowing look. "Linda's lucky to have found someone who appreciates the craftsmanship of quality work. Good repair people are harder to find these days than you might think." I was about to respond when Linda appeared, in the doorway, wearing paint-splattered jeans and a faded concert t-shirt that somehow looked effortlessly stylish on her. Her hair was loose around her shoulders this morning, and she looked more rested than she had the day before, as if our conversation had settled something that had been keeping her awake. "Carol, are you recruiting my handyman for the neighborhood watch committee?" Linda asked with mock severity. "Because I have first claim on his services today." She caught my eye with a smile that made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "Just being neighborly," Carol replied innocently, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "And making sure he knows that good work gets noticed around here. We appreciate people who take pride in what they do." She gathered up her empty plate and headed back toward her own house, calling over her shoulder, "Tyler, you make sure to get some footage of that mirror when it's finished. I want to see how it turns out." Tyler grinned and followed me inside, camera in hand, apparently planning to document the entire restoration process. Linda led us upstairs, and I was struck again by how the morning light transformed the bedroom, making it feel less like a space someone was camping in temporarily, and more like a room where someone was genuinely starting to build a life. I set up my workspace carefully, laying out tools and materials on a cloth I'd brought to protect the hardwood floor. The replacement glass was wrapped in protective film, and I'd brought several grades of silver polish along with soft cloths and detail brushes. Tyler positioned himself in a corner where he could film without getting in the way, occasionally asking questions about technique that showed he was genuinely interested in understanding the process. "This frame is really beautiful," I said, examining the ornate silver work up close. "See these details along the edges? This is hand engraved, probably done by a craftsman who learned traditional European techniques. The oxidation has actually protected some of the finer work from wear. When we clean this up, you're going to see patterns and textures that have been hidden for decades." Linda perched on the edge of the bed, watching with the focused attention of someone for whom visual details mattered professionally. "As an art teacher, I should probably know more about metalwork and restoration techniques," she said. "I focus so much on painting and drawing that I sometimes forget how many other forms of artistry surround us every day. That's one of the things I love about this kind of work," I replied, starting to carefully clean the frame with a soft brush and mild solution. "Every piece has a story, and part of my job is uncovering what the original craftsman intended while respecting the history that's accumulated over time. This mirror has been reflecting people's lives for 70 years. It's witnessed probably thousands of moments, from getting ready for first dates to preparing for job interviews to checking appearances before important conversations." Tyler zoomed in with his camera as I worked, capturing the way tarnish lifted away to reveal intricate scrollwork and delicate flourishes that had been invisible under the oxidation. Linda moved closer, fascinated by the transformation happening under my hands. "It's like archaeology," she said softly, "uncovering layers of time to find what was always there underneath. I do something similar with my students sometimes, helping them discover techniques and perspectives they didn't know they possessed. There's something magical about revelation, about seeing clearly for the first time." The work was meditative, requiring patience and attention to detail that made conversation flow naturally. Tyler asked thoughtful questions about my background, and I found myself talking about my transition from hotel maintenance to independent handyman work with more openness than I'd expected. There was something about being filmed that paradoxically made me feel less self-conscious, as if the camera created a buffer that allowed for more honest communication. Linda shared stories about her teaching, about the adult students in her community art classes who brought such different life experiences to their creative work. She talked about a retired accountant who discovered he had a gift for watercolor landscapes, and a young mother who used painting as meditation while her toddler napped. Her voice took on a different quality when she talked about her students, warmer and more confident, revealing the teacher who'd spent decades helping people discover their capabilities. The revelation came when I was cleaning the back edge of the frame, working around the mounting hardware to reach spots that had probably never been touched since the mirror was originally installed. My brush caught on something that felt different from the smooth silver surface, and when I looked closer, I realized there was a small hinged panel built into the decorative scrollwork. "Linda," I said carefully, "have you ever noticed that there's a hidden compartment in this frame?" She moved quickly to where I was working, Tyler right behind her with the camera. "What do you mean, a compartment?" I pointed to the area I'd been cleaning, where the outline of a small rectangular panel was now visible against the restored silver. "It's incredibly well disguised, built right into the decorative pattern so you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it. See this scroll? Here, it's actually a tiny hinge, and this section here pushes in like a button." Tyler was practically vibrating with excitement. "This is amazing. It's like finding a secret passage in an old house. What do you think is in there?" Linda's face had gone pale, and she was staring at the hidden panel with an expression I couldn't quite read. "My grandmother never mentioned anything about a compartment," she said slowly. "But then again, there were a lot of things she never talked about. Her family came from Chicago during some difficult times, and she wasn't one to dwell on the past." With Linda's permission, I carefully pressed the concealed button mechanism. The panel opened with a soft click, revealing a small space lined with what appeared to be black velvet. Inside were several items wrapped in oiled silk. A small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a photograph in a silver locket, and what looked like a folded document with official seals. Tyler's camera captured every detail as Linda carefully lifted out the items with trembling hands. The photograph in the locket showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Linda, with the same intelligent eyes and determined expression. The letters were written in a flowing script that spoke of careful education and formal manners, dated from the early 1950s. But it was the document that made Linda gasp audibly. It was a deed, beautifully illuminated with official stamps and signatures, showing ownership of not just the house we were sitting in, but the entire block of Maple Grove Avenue. The name on the deed was Elena Rossetti, and the date was 1952. Tyler lowered his camera for a moment, recognizing that we'd stumbled into something larger than a documentary project. Linda was studying the deed with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been decades in the making. "Elena Rossetti was my grandmother's name before she married," Linda said quietly. "But I never knew she'd owned property here. My family always said she and my grandfather were renters when they first moved to Ohio, that they saved for years before they could afford to buy their first house." I examined the deed more carefully, noting the legal descriptions and boundary markers. "According to this document, your grandmother owned not just this house, but the entire block. These properties were apparently developed as rental units, with your grandmother as the landlord. That would have been unusual for a young Italian immigrant woman in 1952. The letters provided more pieces of the puzzle. Written in a mixture of English and Italian, they told the story of a young woman who'd fled Chicago after her first husband was killed, in what appeared to be organized crime violence. She'd come to Ohio with enough money to purchase land and build rental properties, creating a new identity and a safe haven for herself and eventually her second husband, Linda's grandfather. Tyler had resumed filming, understanding that he was witnessing the kind of discovery that documentary makers dream about. "This is incredible," he said softly. "Your grandmother wasn't just a tenant or even a homeowner. She was a businesswoman, a property developer. She created this entire neighborhood." Linda was reading through the letters with tears in her eyes. "Listen to this," she said, translating from one of the Italian passages. "I have built something good here, something safe, When I look in my mirror each morning, I see not the frightened girl who ran from Chicago, but a woman who can provide homes for families, who can create the kind of community where people help each other instead of hurt each other. The significance of the hidden compartment became clear as we continued to examine its contents. Elena had created a record of her true history, documenting not just her property ownership, but her transformation from victim to entrepreneur. The mirror hadn't just reflected her image each morning. It had guarded the secret of her strength and accomplishment. But the documents raised new questions that seemed to resonate beyond the historical mystery. If Elena had owned the entire block, what had happened to that ownership? Why had the family history portrayed her as a struggling immigrant rather than a successful businesswoman? And what implications might these discoveries have for the current residents of Maple Grove Avenue? Tyler was filming Linda's emotional reaction to reading her grandmother's words, but he was also asking practical questions that showed he understood the potential complexity of the situation. What happens when you find out your family owned property that other people have been living in for decades? Do these documents have any legal significance today? Linda looked up from the letters with an expression that mixed wonder with concern. I have no idea, she said honestly. But I think I need to find out more about what happened between 1952 and now. How did my grandmother go from being a property owner to the struggling widow my family always described? Where did the money go? And why was this hidden away like a secret that needed to be protected? As I continued working on the mirror frame, cleaning away decades of oxidation to reveal the beautiful craftsmanship underneath, I couldn't help but think about the parallels between the restoration process and Linda's family mystery. Both involved uncovering what had been hidden, revealing the true beauty and value that had been obscured by time and circumstance. The morning had started as a simple repair job and transformed into something that felt like destiny. Linda was discovering that her family history was more complex and empowering than she'd ever imagined, just as she was working to rebuild her own sense of identity and worth. The mirror that had seemed like just another possession requiring maintenance was revealing itself to be a treasure chest of family secrets and forgotten strength. Tyler captured every moment of the discovery process, understanding that he was documenting not just a historical mystery but a personal transformation. Linda was sitting straighter, speaking with more confidence, asking questions with the authority of someone who'd just learned she came from a line of strong, capable women who'd faced challenges and created solutions. As I prepared to install the new glass and properly mount the restored mirror, I realized that Linda's question from the day before about whether 50-year-old bodies were attractive had been answered in a way none of us could have anticipated. She was discovering that she came from a tradition of women who'd found their own worth, created their own security, and built communities where people could thrive. The attractiveness she'd been questioning wasn't about physical appearance at all. It was about the confidence that came from understanding your own strength and the legacy of strength you'd inherited. The mirror was ready to reflect clearly again, and Linda was ready to see herself as the descendant of Elena Rossetti, a woman who'd transformed loss into opportunity and fear into the foundation for something lasting and beautiful. But the discovery also raised questions that would require investigation, community involvement, and possibly some difficult conversations with neighbors who might be affected by the revelation of Elena's original property ownership. Tyler was already planning how to incorporate this discovery into his documentary, understanding that he'd stumbled onto the kind of authentic story that could illuminate larger themes about family, community, and the hidden histories that shape our understanding of ourselves and our places in the world. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, starting with David Kim from down the street, who appeared at Linda's front door carrying a laptop bag and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who worked from home and occasionally forgot what day it was. David was one of those quietly competent people who seemed to understand technology on an intuitive level while remaining perpetually surprised by human social dynamics. His 13-year-old daughter, Sophie, was with him, a serious girl with her father's analytical mind and an apparent fascination with Tyler's documentary project. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that something interesting was happening over here, David said, adjusting his glasses nervously. Carol mentioned you'd found some kind of historical documents. I do graphic design for a living, mostly digital these days, but I have some experience with document restoration and authentication. Sophie's been working on a local history project for school, and she's become quite the amateur detective when it comes to property records and city archives. Sophie stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "I've been researching the development patterns in this neighborhood for my social studies class," she said matter-of-factly. "There are some really interesting inconsistencies in the official records from the 1950s. Several properties show ownership, transfers that don't quite make sense given the economic conditions of the time. If you found documents that might fill in some of those gaps, it could be historically significant beyond just your family story." Tyler immediately perked up at the prospect of having another young person to collaborate with, especially one who shared his interest in uncovering hidden narratives. Linda invited them both inside, and soon we had an impromptu research team gathered around the dining room table, examining Elena's documents under David's professional-grade magnifying glass, while Sophie took detailed notes on her tablet. David's expertise proved invaluable as he examined the deed and letters with the trained eye of someone accustomed to working with visual details. "The paper quality is consistent with the period," he observed, holding one of the letters up to the light. "The ink shows the right kind of aging patterns, and the handwriting style matches what you'd expect from someone educated in the 1940s. More importantly, the legal language in the deed uses terminology that was standard for Ohio property transfers in the early 1950s but changed significantly by the end of that decade." Sophie was already cross-referencing information on her tablet, pulling up property records from the county assessor's website and comparing them with the documents Linda had found. "This is really weird," she said, frowning at her screen. "According to current records, this entire block was developed by something called Maple Grove Development Corporation in 1953. But I can't find any information about who owned or operated that corporation. It's like it existed just long enough to sell all these properties and then disappeared." The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and I found myself drawn into the investigation despite having come here simply to fix a mirror. There was something compelling about the way these different pieces of expertise were coming together to illuminate a story that had been hidden for decades. Tyler was documenting everything with his camera, understanding that he was witnessing the kind of collaborative discovery that rarely happened outside of academic research projects. Linda was studying her grandmother's letters with renewed focus, translating passages that revealed more details about Elena's circumstances and motivations. "Listen to this one," she said, reading from a letter dated 1954. "The lawyer says I must be careful about how the business appears in official records. A woman owning so much property draws attention I cannot afford. Better to let people think I am simply a tenant like everyone else. The money is safely invested and my children will inherit what I have built, but they must never know the dangers I face to create this security for them." "That explains a lot," David said thoughtfully. "If your grandmother was trying to hide her ownership for safety reasons, she might have created a shell corporation to handle the property management while keeping her name off public records. It was actually a fairly sophisticated approach for someone supposedly unfamiliar with American business practices." Sophie looked up from her tablet with excitement. "I think I found something. There's a David Kim who used to work for the city planning department in the 1950s. Not me, obviously, but maybe a relative. And there are some archived city council meeting minutes that mention disputes over zoning changes in this neighborhood around 1955. Let me see if I can access more detailed records." The investigation was taking on a momentum of its own, with each discovery leading to new questions and potential research directions. Tyler suggested that we needed more systematic documentation of what we were finding, and Sophie immediately offered to create a digital archive that could organize documents, photographs, and research findings in a way that would be accessible to everyone involved. But it was David who raised the question that had been lurking beneath all our excitement about the historical mystery. "Have you thought about what happens if these documents establish that your grandmother's estate still has legal claims to properties that other people have been paying mortgages on for decades? This could affect everyone in the neighborhood, not just your family." Linda's face sobered as the implications became clear. The discovery that had initially felt like a wonderful revelation about her grandmother's strength and accomplishment suddenly carried the potential for serious disruption to the lives of people who'd become her neighbors and friends. Carol Martinez had been living in her house for over 30 years. David and Sophie had built their life in what they believed was their own home. How do you balance historical justice with present-day stability? Tyler lowered his camera, recognizing that the conversation had moved into territory that required careful consideration rather than documentary filming. This is getting really complicated, isn't it? He said. I mean, it's amazing that we found all this stuff about Elena Rossetti, but now what? Do you have to tell everyone what we discovered? Do you have legal obligations if these documents are authentic? David pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what appeared to be legal research websites. Property law isn't my area of expertise, but I think there are statutes of limitations that might apply to claims this old. Also, if your grandmother deliberately created legal structures to transfer ownership, those transfers might be valid regardless of her original intentions. But you definitely need to consult with a real estate attorney to understand your options. The mood in the room had shifted from excitement to contemplation, as everyone grappled with the complexity of what we'd uncovered. Linda looked at the documents spread across her dining room table with an expression that mixed pride in her grandmother's accomplishments with concern about unintended consequences for her neighbors. Sophie, with the directness that only 13-year-olds can manage, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Mrs. Thompson, what do you want to happen? I mean, do you want to own all these houses, or do you just want to know the truth about your grandmother's story? Linda was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think I want to understand the whole truth first, she said finally. My grandmother obviously went to great lengths to protect her family and create opportunities for people to have good homes. I can't imagine she would have wanted her legacy to become a source of conflict or displacement for the community she helped create. That's when Carol Martinez appeared at the front door, apparently drawn by the sight of multiple cars in Linda's driveway and the general sense that something significant was happening. Carol had the uncanny ability to sense neighborhood developments before anyone thought to inform her officially, and she arrived carrying a covered dish that suggested she'd come prepared to stay and contribute to whatever discussion was taking place. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, Carol said, with the kind of smile that indicated she knew perfectly well that she was interrupting something very important indeed. But I brought some of my famous chicken casserole, and I couldn't help noticing that you seem to have convened some kind of research committee over here. Linda looked around at the assembled group, realizing that what had started as a simple mirror repair had evolved into something that felt like a community meeting. Tyler was still holding his camera, but had stopped filming out of respect for the privacy of the conversation. Sophie had her tablet open to property records and historical documents. David was surrounded by the tools of document analysis, and Linda's dining room table looked like the headquarters of an amateur historical society. Actually, Carol, your timing is perfect, Linda said. We've discovered some things about my grandmother's history in this neighborhood that you might find interesting. And we could probably use your perspective on how to handle information that might affect the entire community. Carol set down her casserole and took a seat at the table with the air of someone settling in for a story she'd been waiting decades to hear. I had a feeling Elena Rossetti was more than she appeared to be, she said matter-of-factly. A single woman in the 1950s who always seemed to have money for improvements to her property, who spoke with authority about neighborhood planning and development, who somehow knew exactly which families would be good additions to the community. That doesn't happen by accident. Sophie immediately launched into an explanation of what they'd discovered, showing Carol the documents and research findings with the enthusiasm of someone sharing detective work with an appreciative audience. Carol examined everything with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered, asking questions that revealed she'd been observing and remembering neighborhood patterns for far longer than anyone had realized. This explains so much about the character of this street, Carol said after reviewing the evidence. Elena didn't just own property, she curated a community. Look at the families who were chosen as tenants and eventual owners. Teachers, craftsmen, small business owners, people who would contribute to the stability and culture of the neighborhood. She was creating something intentional, something that would last. David nodded thoughtfully. That would explain why this block has always felt different from the surrounding area. The houses are well maintained, the neighbors actually know each other. There's a sense of shared investment in keeping the community strong. If Elena was selecting residents based on their potential contribution to neighborhood life, she was essentially designing a social experiment in cooperative living. Tyler raised his camera again, realizing that Carol's perspective was adding crucial context to the story they were uncovering. Mrs. Martinez, did you ever suspect that there was something unusual about how this neighborhood was organized? Carol smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose long-held suspicions were finally being validated. Honey, I've been wondering about the real story behind this street for 30 years. Too many things that seemed coincidental, too many residents, who just happened to be exactly the kind of people who would make good neighbors. Elena Rossetti was playing a much longer game than anyone realized. The conversation continued as the afternoon stretched toward evening, with each person contributing different pieces of expertise and perspective to the growing understanding of Elena's legacy. Sophie discovered city council records that showed Elena attending planning meetings and advocating for zoning changes that would protect the residential character of the area. David found evidence of Elena's involvement in early community organizations and local business development. Carol provided memories and observations that filled in gaps in the official records. But it was Linda who posed the question that would determine what happened next. Assuming all of this is true, and my grandmother really did create this community through careful planning and selection of residents, what would she want us to do with this information now? How do we honor her intentions, while respecting the lives that people have built here over the past 70 years? Tyler suggested that the answer might lie in Elena's own words, in the letters and documents she'd hidden away for future generations to discover. Maybe she left clues about what she hoped would happen when her story was finally revealed. Sophie immediately offered to create a complete digital archive of all the documents, making them searchable and cross-referenced so that patterns and intentions might become clearer. David proposed that they needed more legal research before making any decisions about how to proceed. Understanding the current legal status of property ownership would be essential before determining what options Linda might have and what obligations she might face regarding disclosure of the historical information. Carol suggested that the neighborhood itself should be involved in deciding how to respond to these revelations. After all, if Elena had intentionally created a community of people who would work together to maintain and protect what she'd built, then those people deserved to be part of any decisions about how her legacy would be handled. As the group began to disperse, each person taking on specific research tasks and promising to reconvene within a few days, Linda pulled me aside while I finished the final details of mounting the restored mirror. The glass was perfectly clear, now reflecting the room with crisp accuracy, and the frame gleamed with the beauty of its original craftsmanship. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something personal. This whole discovery has made me realize how much I don't know about building something lasting, something that will matter beyond my own lifetime. My grandmother apparently created an entire community legacy, and here I am at 52 wondering if I'm attractive enough to start dating again. Do you think I'm focusing on the wrong things?" I stepped back from the mirror, which was now properly mounted and reflecting the room exactly as it should. The question felt like a continuation of our conversation from the day before, but with deeper implications after everything we'd learned about Elena's story. "I think your grandmother would probably tell you that attractiveness comes from knowing your own worth and having the confidence to build something meaningful," I said carefully. "She created this community because she understood that real security comes from surrounding yourself with people who share your values and will work together to protect what matters. Maybe the question isn't whether you're attractive to random people, but whether you're ready to attract the kind of people who will help you build the life you actually want." Linda studied her reflection in the newly restored mirror, and I could see her considering not just her physical appearance, but the larger question of what she wanted to create with the second half of her life. The mirror that had started as a simple repair project had become a window into family history, community legacy, and personal transformation. Tyler appeared in the bedroom doorway, camera lowered respectfully. "Aunt Linda, I just wanted to say that filming all this today has made me understand something important about my own family situation. Watching you discover your grandmother's strength is helping me realize that maybe my parents' divorce doesn't have to be the end of our family story. Maybe it's just the beginning of a different kind of story, one where we all get to choose who we want to become." The day had transformed everyone involved, revealing not just historical secrets, but contemporary possibilities for growth, connection, and community building. As I packed up my tools for what I thought would be the final time, I realized that Linda's mirror was now reflecting much more than just her image. It was reflecting the potential for a neighborhood to rediscover its founding principles and decide how to carry Elena Rossetti's vision forward into the 21st century. 3 weeks later, the entire block of Maple Grove Avenue was buzzing, with an energy that reminded Carol Martinez of the old days when neighbors actually talked to each other about things that mattered. Linda's living room had become an unofficial community center, with residents dropping by at all hours to examine the growing collection of historical documents, contribute their own family stories, and participate in what had evolved into the most ambitious neighborhood research project anyone could remember. Sophie Kim had created a digital archive that was impressive enough to earn her early admission consideration at Ohio State's history program, despite being only 13. Her systematic approach to document organization had revealed patterns that none of the adults had noticed, including a series of coded references in Elena's letters that suggested she'd been part of a larger network of women helping families escape dangerous situations in major cities throughout the Midwest. David had taken a leave of absence from his graphic design work to focus on what he was calling the Elena Rossetti investigation, using his technical skills to enhance photographs and documents that had been damaged by decades of storage. His work had uncovered details in the original deed that proved Elena hadn't just purchased the property. She'd actually designed the entire neighborhood layout, specifying everything from the placement of oak trees to the orientation of houses to maximize both privacy and community interaction. Tyler's documentary project had evolved far beyond a high school assignment into something that local historians were calling a significant contribution to understanding post-war immigration patterns and women's entrepreneurship in the industrial Midwest. He'd interviewed not just the current residents of Maple Grove Avenue, but elderly relatives of original tenants, who remembered Elena Rossetti as a woman who somehow always knew exactly what struggling families needed to get back on their feet. But it was Linda who had undergone the most profound transformation during those 3 weeks of discovery and community building. The woman who had asked me whether 50-year-old bodies were attractive had evolved into someone who commanded attention not because of her appearance, but because of her growing reputation as a thoughtful leader who could navigate complex situations with both compassion and practical wisdom. The legal research that David had initiated had revealed something that surprised everyone, including the real estate attorney Linda had finally consulted. Elena's original property transfers had been structured in such a way that current residents actually had stronger legal claims to their homes than they would have under normal circumstances. Rather than creating potential conflicts, Elena's hidden ownership had established a unique form of community land trust that protected residents from displacement and speculation, while maintaining collective responsibility for neighborhood character and maintenance. The attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in property law and historical land rights, had been fascinated enough by the case to reduce her fees significantly in exchange for permission to use Elena's documents as the basis for academic research into innovative property ownership models. According to Rebecca's analysis, Elena had essentially created an early version of what urban planners now called community land trust development, 50 years before such concepts became popular in progressive housing policy. What your grandmother did was legally brilliant and socially visionary, Rebecca had explained to Linda during a community meeting that filled Linda's living room beyond capacity. She created a structure that gave residents security of ownership while maintaining community control over who could join the neighborhood and how properties could be used. The coded language in her original documents establishes principles that actually strengthen current property rights rather than threatening them. Carol Martinez had been vindicated in her long-held suspicions about the intentional character of Maple Grove Avenue, and she'd thrown herself into organizing what she called Elena Appreciation Month, with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting decades for an excuse to celebrate the neighborhood's unique history. Her research into Elena's community involvement had revealed that Elena had quietly funded everything from after-school programs to small business loans for neighborhood residents throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. The most significant discovery had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, a 93-year-old woman who lived in the senior community center across town, had heard about the Elena Rossetti research through her great-niece Sophie, and had contacted Linda with information that changed everything they thought they knew about Elena's motivations and methods. Mrs. Patterson had been one of Elena's original tenants, a young war widow with 2 small children who'd been struggling to find affordable housing in the discriminatory rental market of the 1950s. Elena hadn't just provided her with a home, she'd connected her with other single mothers in the neighborhood, helped her find reliable childcare, and even provided informal business mentoring when Mrs. Patterson started a small catering company that had eventually supported her family for 30 years. Elena never made it seem like charity. Mrs. Patterson had told the assembled neighborhood group during an emotional interview that Tyler filmed for his documentary. She made it seem like she was lucky to have found tenants who would take such good care of her properties. But looking back, I realized she was running a sophisticated support network for families that other landlords wouldn't even consider renting to. Single mothers, immigrant families, people recovering from financial setbacks, mixed-race couples who couldn't find acceptance in other neighborhoods. Elena saw potential where other people saw problems. The interview with Mrs. Patterson had revealed the full scope of Elena's vision and the careful thought she'd put into creating not just a profitable property development, but a functioning community where people with different backgrounds and challenges could build stable, successful lives together. Her coded references in the hidden letters weren't just about protecting herself from past dangers. They were instructions for future generations about how to maintain the inclusive, supportive character she'd worked so hard to establish. Linda had been profoundly moved by Mrs. Patterson's stories, recognizing in Elena's approach to community building a template for how she wanted to approach her own second act in life. The question about attractiveness had been answered not by external validation, but by discovering that she came from a tradition of women who found their worth through creating opportunities for others to thrive. The neighborhood's response to these revelations had been overwhelmingly positive, with residents expressing pride in being part of Elena's legacy and commitment to maintaining the principles she'd established. David Kim had proposed that they formalize some of Elena's original community agreements, creating contemporary versions of her mutual support systems and inclusive housing policies. Sophie had suggested that they establish an Elena Rossetti Scholarship Fund to help local students pursue education in community development, urban planning, or social entrepreneurship. Tyler wanted to expand his documentary into a broader exploration of how immigrant women had shaped American communities in ways that traditional history books had overlooked. Carol Martinez had organized a neighborhood celebration that turned into an impromptu block party, with residents sharing family stories, traditional foods, and memories of community members who'd embodied Elena's values over the decades. The celebration had attracted attention from local news media and urban planning researchers, establishing Maple Grove Avenue as a model for intentional community development that balanced individual property rights with collective social responsibility. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire Elena Rossetti investigation had been the way it had brought Linda and me together as partners in both the research project and, gradually, in life. Working together to understand Elena's legacy had created a foundation of shared values and mutual respect that felt more solid than any relationship either of us had experienced before. Linda's confidence had blossomed as she'd stepped into a leadership role in the community, organizing meetings, facilitating discussions between neighbors with different perspectives, and developing plans for preserving Elena's legacy while adapting her principles to contemporary challenges. The woman who'd been uncertain about her attractiveness at 52 had become someone who drew people to her through her ability to listen carefully, think strategically, and help others feel valued and heard. The mirror that had started this entire journey now reflected not just Linda's image, but the image of a woman who'd found her purpose in continuing her grandmother's work of community building. The restoration had revealed not just the beauty of Elena's original mirror, but the beauty of Elena's original vision for what a neighborhood could become when people committed to supporting each other's success and well-being. Tyler had eventually returned to his parents' house when school started, but not before establishing himself as the neighborhood's unofficial historian and documentary filmmaker. His footage of the Elena discovery process had become the foundation for a multimedia presentation that the community used to explain their unique history to visitors and researchers. More importantly, Tyler's own confidence had grown through his involvement in adult conversations about community values, historical preservation, and social responsibility. Sophie Kim had become Linda's unofficial apprentice in community organizing, learning firsthand how to facilitate productive discussions, build consensus around complex issues, and maintain focus on shared goals even when individual interests diverged. Her academic success with the Elena Research Project had opened doors to advanced placement courses and early college opportunities, but she'd also gained something more valuable, an understanding of how ordinary people could work together to create extraordinary communities. David had discovered that his skills in visual communication and project management were perfectly suited to community development work, and he'd begun volunteering with housing organizations throughout Ohio that were trying to implement community land trust models inspired by Elena's pioneering work. His involvement in the Elena project had also helped him become more comfortable with leadership roles and public speaking, transforming him from a shy work-from-home designer into someone who could effectively advocate for progressive housing policies at city council meetings. Carol Martinez had achieved what she'd been working toward for decades: recognition of Maple Grove Avenue as a historically significant community that deserved preservation and celebration. Her documentation of neighborhood traditions and resident stories had contributed to a successful application for historic district status, ensuring that Elena's vision would be protected from commercial development or gentrification pressures. The success of the Elena Rossetti project had attracted attention from urban planning schools, community development organizations, and housing policy researchers throughout the region. Linda had been invited to speak at conferences about grassroots historical research, community organizing, and preserving affordable housing through innovative ownership models. But she'd turned down most of these opportunities, preferring to focus on the ongoing work of maintaining and strengthening the community Elena had created. The relationship between Linda and me had developed naturally as we'd worked together on various aspects of the Elena project, from organizing community meetings to collaborating on a neighborhood improvement fund that would address maintenance and enhancement projects while preserving the character Elena had established. Our partnership felt like a logical extension of the community building work we'd both become passionate about, rather than a separate romantic development. Linda's question about the attractiveness of 50-year-old bodies had been answered, definitively, though not in the way either of us had expected when she'd first asked it. The attractiveness that mattered wasn't about competing with younger women for attention from men who valued superficial characteristics. It was about the magnetic pull of someone who'd found her purpose, developed her capabilities, and committed herself to creating something meaningful that would benefit others. When we'd finally moved in together, 6 months after the Mirror restoration project, it had felt like a natural evolution of our partnership, rather than a dramatic romantic gesture. We'd already been spending most of our time working together on community projects, cooking meals for neighborhood gatherings, and planning improvements to Linda's house that would better accommodate the steady stream of visitors drawn to learn about Elena's legacy. The Mirror itself had become something of a neighborhood landmark, with visitors asking to see the hidden compartment and hear the story of Elena's secret documents. Linda had decided to leave the compartment open, displaying some of Elena's letters and photographs as a reminder of the vision and courage that had created the community we were all working to preserve and strengthen. Tyler's documentary about Elena Rossetti and the Maple Grove Avenue community had eventually been accepted into several student film festivals, earning recognition for its thoughtful exploration of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change through patient, strategic community building. But more importantly, the film had become a tool for inspiring similar research projects in other neighborhoods, encouraging people to investigate their own local history and discover hidden stories of innovation and resilience. The legal framework that Elena had created had proven remarkably durable and adaptable, providing a model that housing advocates and policymakers were studying as a potential solution to affordability crises in communities throughout the Midwest. Rebecca Chen had published several academic papers based on her analysis of Elena's documents, establishing Elena Rossetti as a significant but previously unrecognized pioneer in community-controlled housing development. As I stood in Linda's bedroom one morning, adjusting the restored mirror that had started this entire transformation, I reflected on how a simple repair job had evolved into something that changed not just Linda's understanding of herself, but an entire community's understanding of its history and potential. The mirror reflected clearly now, showing Linda as she prepared for another day of community organizing, neighborhood planning meetings, and collaborative problem-solving. She caught my eye in the mirror and smiled with the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world and her purpose in life. The question about attractiveness had been answered not by external validation, but by the recognition that true attractiveness came from knowing your worth, understanding your heritage, and committing yourself to building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. The Elena Rossetti legacy had taught all of us that the most important work often happened quietly, without recognition or fanfare, through patient daily efforts to create opportunities for others to succeed and thrive. Linda had embraced that lesson completely, transforming from someone questioning her own value into someone who helped others recognize and develop their own potential. 2 years had passed since that Tuesday morning when Linda Thompson asked me whether I found 50-year-old bodies attractive. and the question had taken on layers of meaning that neither of us could have anticipated. Standing in what was now our shared home office, surrounded by correspondence from urban planning researchers, community development organizations, and documentary filmmakers from around the world, I marveled at how a simple mirror repair had catalyzed changes that rippled far beyond Maple Grove Avenue. The Elena Rossetti Community Development Institute had grown from Linda's dining room table discussions into a nationally recognized model for grassroots historical research and community-controlled housing policy. What started as neighbors trying to understand one woman's hidden documents had evolved into a comprehensive approach to neighborhood revitalization that preserved affordability while celebrating cultural heritage and promoting economic stability. Linda had become the Institute's executive director, a role that seemed tailor-made for someone with her combination of artistic vision, teaching experience, and newfound confidence in community leadership. Her transformation from a recently divorced woman questioning her own worth into a nationally recognized expert on community development had been remarkable to witness. But it felt like a natural evolution of qualities that had always been present, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The Institute operated out of a restored Victorian house that the neighborhood had collectively purchased, using funds generated by Elena's original property investment structure. The building served as both headquarters for research and advocacy work, and as a community center where residents could access resources for everything from home maintenance workshops to small business development programs to conflict mediation services. Tyler Thompson had graduated high school with early admission to Ohio State's documentary film program, largely based on the strength of his Elena Rossetti project and subsequent films documenting community development initiatives in other Ohio neighborhoods. But he'd deferred enrollment for a year to work full-time with the Institute, traveling throughout the Midwest to help other communities conduct their own historical research and discover hidden stories that might inform contemporary planning decisions. His most recent project involved documenting similar patterns of community development by immigrant women in Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago, revealing a previously unknown network of informal housing advocates who'd created stable neighborhoods during the economic turbulence of the 1950s and 1960s. Tyler's work was establishing Elena Rossetti not as an isolated case, but as part of a broader movement of women who'd used property development as a tool for social justice and community building. Sophie Kim had just completed her freshman year at Ohio State with a double major in urban planning and digital humanities, having developed technological tools for historical research that were being adopted by academic institutions throughout the region. Her digital archive of Elena's documents had evolved into a comprehensive database of community development innovations that researchers could use to identify successful models for contemporary application. But Sophie's most significant contribution had been developing what she called community DNA analysis, a methodology for identifying the underlying social and economic structures that made certain neighborhoods resilient while others struggled with instability and displacement. Her research was revealing patterns that policymakers could use to replicate successful community development approaches in areas facing housing affordability crises. David Kim had left graphic design entirely to become the Institute's Director of Community Engagement, using his technical skills and natural empathy to facilitate discussions between residents, researchers, and policymakers who brought very different perspectives to neighborhood development challenges. His work had proven essential for maintaining the collaborative spirit that made the Elena model successful, ensuring that academic research served community needs rather than replacing community voices. David's approach to community engagement had attracted attention from urban planning schools nationwide, leading to invitations to develop curriculum that would train future planners in genuinely participatory development practices. His methods emphasized listening skills, cultural sensitivity, and long-term relationship building as essential professional competencies for anyone working in community development. Carol Martinez had become the Institute's oral history coordinator, systematically documenting stories from long-term residents throughout Ohio who remembered innovative community leaders from the post-war era. Her work was revealing that Elena's approach to inclusive neighborhood development had been more widespread than anyone had realized, suggesting that communities throughout the industrial Midwest had benefited from informal networks of women who'd used property ownership as a platform for social change. Carol's interviews were uncovering stories of women who'd created everything from cooperative childcare networks to informal lending circles to community gardens that provided both food security and social connection for immigrant families adjusting to life in American cities. These stories were challenging traditional narratives about suburban development that emphasized individual homeownership rather than collective community building. The success of the Elena Rossetti model had attracted attention from housing policy researchers, leading to pilot programs in several Ohio cities that attempted to recreate Elena's community land trust approach using contemporary legal frameworks. The results had been promising enough to generate federal funding for expanded research into community-controlled development models that could address both affordability and social cohesion challenges facing American neighborhoods. Linda had been invited to testify before congressional committees studying housing policy, sharing Elena's story as an example of innovative approaches that had worked effectively for decades before being recognized by mainstream policymakers. Her testimony had emphasized that successful community development required understanding local history, building on existing social networks, and maintaining long-term commitment to inclusive growth, rather than pursuing short-term profit maximization. But the most meaningful recognition of Elena's legacy had come from the families who'd been directly impacted by the Institute's work in other communities. Letters arrived regularly from residents of neighborhoods that had used Elena's principles to prevent displacement, improve housing conditions, and strengthen social connections that made their communities more resilient during economic and social challenges. A single mother in Cleveland had written to thank Linda for helping her neighborhood organize a community land trust that enabled families to remain in homes they'd been renting for years, providing security that allowed children to attend the same schools and maintain friendships that contributed to their academic and social development. An elderly couple in Youngstown had described how Elena's model had inspired their neighborhood to create a mutual aid network that helped residents age in place, rather than being forced to relocate when they needed additional support. The Institute had also attracted international attention, with delegations of community development practitioners from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia visiting Maple Grove Avenue to study Elena's approach and consider adaptations for their own national contexts. Linda had been invited to speak at conferences in Toronto, London, and Copenhagen, sharing Elena's story as an example of grassroots innovation that anticipated policy developments by several decades. Tyler's documentary work had expanded to include these international connections, creating a film series that explored how Elena's principles were being adapted and applied in communities facing very different economic and cultural challenges. His most recent project followed a group of refugee families in Minneapolis who'd used community land trust principles to create stable housing that preserved their cultural traditions while providing economic security in their new country. The personal relationship between Linda and me had deepened alongside these professional developments, creating a partnership that felt both romantically fulfilling and practically effective for the work we'd both become passionate about. We'd married in a ceremony held in the community garden that residents had created in the vacant lot, where Elena's original property development plans had included space for shared recreation and food production. The wedding had been a neighborhood celebration that reflected the inclusive, intergenerational community Elena had envisioned, with guests ranging from Mrs. Patterson, now 95 and still sharp as ever, to toddlers whose families had moved to Maple Grove Avenue specifically because of its reputation for supporting young parents and providing safe environments for children to develop strong community connections. Our daily life together involved a mixture of institute work, neighborhood maintenance projects, and personal relationship building that felt seamlessly integrated rather than compartmentalized into separate professional and private spheres. Linda's question about attractiveness had been answered not just through external recognition of her accomplishments, but through the deep satisfaction that came from building a life centered around meaningful work and authentic relationships. The mirror that had started this entire transformation had been moved to the Institute's main conference room, where visitors could see Elena's hidden compartment and understand how historical research could reveal contemporary opportunities for community innovation. The mirror served as both an artifact and a symbol, representing the importance of looking beneath surface appearances to discover hidden stories that might inform better approaches to persistent social challenges. Linda often used the mirror during presentations to policymakers and researchers, explaining how Elena's careful documentation of her community development work provided a template for contemporary practitioners who wanted to create lasting change rather than pursuing short-term solutions that failed to address underlying structural problems. The mirror's restoration had become a metaphor for the kind of patient, skilled work required to reveal and preserve community assets that might otherwise be overlooked or discarded. But perhaps the most significant outcome of our Elena Rossetti research had been its impact on other residents of Maple Grove Avenue, who discovered their own capacity for leadership, research, and community organizing through their involvement in documenting and preserving Elena's legacy. The project had revealed that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities for creating positive change when they had access to appropriate tools, supportive relationships, and clear understanding of how their individual contributions connected to larger community goals. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a celebrity in gerontology circles, as researchers studying successful aging realized that her continued vitality and engagement well into her 90s reflected the kind of intergenerational community connections that Elena had intentionally designed into Maple Grove Avenue's social structure. Mrs. Patterson's story was being used to argue for housing policies that prioritize social connection and mutual support, rather than focusing exclusively on physical infrastructure and individual home ownership. The neighborhood itself had achieved recognition as a National Historic District, not just because of Elena's architectural contributions, but because of the ongoing community development work that continued her vision of inclusive, sustainable neighborhood growth. The historic designation provided protection from gentrification pressures while generating tourism revenue that funded continued community development and maintenance projects. Visitors to Maple Grove Avenue often remarked on the tangible sense of community that was evident in everything from well-maintained properties to spontaneous conversations between neighbors to the ease with which residents collaborated on addressing shared challenges. The social infrastructure that Elena had created through careful tenant selection and community norm establishment had proven remarkably durable, adapting to changing demographics while maintaining core principles of mutual support and inclusive decision-making. The Elena Rossetti Community Development Institute had documented these social infrastructure elements, creating toolkits that other communities could use to develop their own approaches to building and maintaining the kind of neighborly relationships that contributed to both individual well-being and collective resilience. The toolkits included everything from conflict resolution protocols to shared resource management systems, to methods for including children and elderly residents in community planning processes. Linda's leadership of this work had been recognized through numerous awards from urban planning organizations, community development associations, and academic institutions studying grassroots approaches to social change. But she consistently emphasized that the real recognition came from letters and visits from residents of other communities who'd successfully applied Elena's principles to address their own neighborhood challenges. The most recent of these success stories involved a rural community in southern Ohio where declining population and economic opportunities had created a cycle of disinvestment and social isolation that threatened the community's long-term viability. Using Elena's model of strategic property acquisition and careful resident selection, the community had attracted new families while providing support systems that helped long-term residents adapt to demographic and economic changes without feeling displaced or marginalized. Tyler's documentary about this rural application of Elena's principles had been selected for screening at the Sundance Film Festival, bringing national attention to community land trust models as viable approaches to rural revitalization. The film's success had generated additional funding for the Institute's work and attracted new partnerships with organizations working on similar challenges in communities throughout Appalachia and the rural Midwest. Sophie's technological innovations had proven essential for scaling Elena's approach to larger populations and more complex urban environments. Her digital tools for community engagement and resource mapping were being used by neighborhood organizations in cities throughout North America, enabling residents to identify assets, coordinate activities, and maintain communication in ways that strengthened social connections rather than replacing face-to-face interaction. David's community engagement methodology had been adopted by planning schools at universities throughout the region, ensuring that future urban planners would understand community development as a collaborative process that required genuine partnership with residents rather than expert-driven intervention that imposed solutions without understanding local needs and preferences. The personal transformation that Linda had experienced through discovering Elena's legacy and developing her own leadership capabilities had become a central theme in her presentations to other communities, beginning their own development work. She often spoke about how Elena's question about attractiveness had been answered not through external validation, but through the confidence that came from understanding her own heritage and developing her own capacity to create positive change. Linda's story resonated particularly strongly with middle-aged women who were navigating divorce, career transitions, or other major life changes that required rebuilding identity and discovering new sources of purpose and fulfillment. The Institute had developed programming specifically for women in transition, providing both practical skills for community organizing and emotional support for personal growth that often accompanied involvement in meaningful social change work. These programs had attracted participants from throughout Ohio and neighboring states, creating networks of women who were applying Elena's principles in their own communities while supporting each other's personal and professional development. The networks had generated additional community development projects, policy advocacy initiatives, and research collaborations that extended Elena's influence far beyond what she could have imagined when she first created her innovative approach to neighborhood development. As I reflected on the 2-year journey from Mirror Repair to Community Development Institute, I was struck by how Linda's initial question about attractiveness had revealed something profound about the connections between personal confidence, community involvement, and social change. Elena's legacy had taught us that true attractiveness came from understanding your own worth, developing your capabilities, and committing to creating something that would benefit others long after your own lifetime. The mirror in the Institute's conference room continued to reflect clearly, showing visitors not just their own images, but the possibility of discovering hidden strengths, uncovering forgotten histories, and building communities that honored both individual dignity and collective well-being. Linda's question had been answered definitively, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been touched by Elena's story and inspired to create their own legacy of community building and social innovation. The work continued every day, with new visitors, new research projects, new communities seeking to understand and apply Elena's principles, and new opportunities to demonstrate that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for creating positive change when they understood their connection to larger purposes and supported each other's growth and development. 5 years after Linda Thompson first asked me whether I found 50-year-old bodies attractive while I repaired her grandmother's mirror, I stood before the United Nations Human Settlements Program in Nairobi, Kenya, preparing to deliver a keynote address about community-led development models that had emerged from a simple neighborhood research project in Ohio. The journey from handyman to international development consultant felt surreal, but it represented the natural evolution of work that had begun with restoring a piece of family furniture and discovering the extraordinary vision of Elena Rossetti. The UN conference brought together urban planners, housing advocates, and community organizers from around the world to share innovations in sustainable neighborhood development. Linda and I had been invited to present the Elena Rossetti model as an example of how grassroots historical research could reveal forgotten approaches to contemporary challenges, particularly in addressing housing affordability, while maintaining community cohesion and cultural preservation. Linda had become the primary spokesperson for what academics were now calling heritage-based community development, an approach that used historical research to identify successful local practices that could inform modern policy and planning decisions. Her transformation from a recently divorced art teacher questioning her own worth to an internationally recognized expert in community development had been remarkable, but it felt like the logical outcome of talents and interests that had always been present, waiting for the right opportunity to flourish. The Elena Rossetti Community Development Institute had expanded far beyond its origins in Maple Grove Avenue, establishing satellite programs in 12 cities across North America and developing partnerships with similar organizations in Europe, Australia, and now Africa. Each program adapted Elena's core principles to local cultural and economic contexts, while maintaining focus on community-controlled development that prioritized long-term resident stability over short-term profit maximization. Tyler Thompson had become the Institute's Director of International Documentation, traveling the world to film communities that were applying Elena's principles in radically different environments. His latest project followed a group of women in Lagos, Nigeria, who had discovered that their grandmothers had developed informal housing cooperatives during the 1960s that anticipated many features of contemporary community land trust models. Tyler's film work was establishing Elena's approach not as an isolated innovation, but as part of a global tradition of women using property development as a tool for social justice. The Lagos project had revealed patterns that challenged conventional assumptions about urban development in rapidly growing cities. Rather than viewing informal settlements as problems requiring external intervention, Tyler's documentary showed how some communities had developed sophisticated systems for self-governance, resource sharing, and conflict resolution that provided stability and opportunity for residents who were excluded from formal housing markets. Sophie Kim had completed her doctorate in urban planning at age 23, having developed digital tools for community engagement that were now being used by neighborhood organizations on 6 continents. Her dissertation research had identified successful community development practices in over 100 cities worldwide, revealing common principles that crossed cultural boundaries while manifesting in locally specific ways that reflected particular histories and circumstances. Sophie's technological innovations had proven particularly valuable for communities dealing with displacement pressures from gentrification or climate change. Her digital platforms enabled residents to document community assets, coordinate mutual aid activities, and maintain social connections even when physical relocation became necessary. The tools were being used by refugee communities, climate migrants, and neighborhoods facing economic transformation to preserve social capital while adapting to new circumstances. David Kim had established the Institute for Participatory Planning at Ohio State University, training a new generation of urban planners in methods that prioritize community voice and local knowledge over expert-driven solutions. His curriculum emphasized relationship building, cultural competency, and long-term commitment as essential skills for effective community development practice. Graduates of his program were working in communities throughout the Americas, applying participatory planning methods that trace their origins to Elena's approach to neighborhood development. David's academic work had gained recognition from planning organizations worldwide, leading to visiting professor positions in Canada, Mexico, and Costa Rica, where he'd helped develop community engagement protocols that were being incorporated into national housing policies. His research demonstrated that participatory planning approaches produced more sustainable and equitable outcomes than traditional top-down development models, even in contexts where community involvement required additional time and resources. Carol Martinez had become something of a legend in oral history circles, having documented over 300 interviews with residents of innovative communities throughout the Midwest. Her work was revealing that Elena's approach to community development had been more widespread than anyone had realized, with similar models emerging in cities throughout the industrial heartland during the post-war economic boom. Carol's interviews were uncovering stories of women who had created everything from cooperative childcare networks to community-supported agriculture programs, to informal banking systems that provided financial services for families excluded from mainstream institutions. These stories were challenging traditional narratives about suburban development that emphasized individual home ownership rather than collective approaches to building economic security and social connection. The most recent recognition of Carol's work had come from the Smithsonian Institution, which had acquired her entire oral history archive for preservation in the National Museum of American History. The collection was being used by researchers studying grassroots approaches to community development, women's entrepreneurship, and innovative responses to housing challenges during periods of rapid social and economic change. Mrs. Patterson had celebrated her 100th birthday the previous year, surrounded by 4 generations of Maple Grove Avenue residents who credited her stories about Elena Rossetti with inspiring their own involvement in community development work. Mrs. Patterson had become the Institute's historian emeritus, continuing to provide perspective on how Elena's principles had evolved and adapted over decades of implementation. Mrs. Patterson's longevity and continued vitality had attracted attention from researchers studying successful aging in community contexts. Her story was being used to demonstrate how intergenerational relationships and meaningful social roles contributed to both physical health and psychological well-being for elderly residents. The research was informing policy discussions about aging in place and the importance of community design that facilitated ongoing participation by residents across the entire lifespan. The Maple Grove Avenue neighborhood itself had become a pilgrimage site for community development practitioners, urban planning students, and housing advocates who wanted to see Elena's principles in action. The neighborhood association had developed tour programs that generated revenue for ongoing community development projects, while educating visitors about practical applications of community land trust models. The tours emphasized that Maple Grove Avenue remained a working neighborhood rather than a museum, with residents continuing to adapt Elena's principles to address contemporary challenges, including climate change adaptation, aging infrastructure, and economic pressures that affected the broader region. Visitors often remarked on the tangible sense of community that was evident in everything from neighbor-to-neighbor interactions to collaborative problem-solving approaches to the ease with which residents included newcomers in ongoing community activities. The success of the Elena Rossetti model had attracted attention from policymakers at state and federal levels, leading to legislation that provided tax incentives for community land trust development and technical assistance for neighborhoods interested in exploring community-controlled housing options. Linda had testified before legislative committees in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, sharing Elena's story as evidence that community-controlled development could address housing affordability while strengthening rather than displacing existing social networks. But the most meaningful recognition of Elena's legacy continued to come from residents of communities that had successfully applied her principles to address their own challenges. Letters and emails arrived regularly from families who had achieved housing stability through community land trusts, neighborhoods that had prevented displacement through collective organizing, and communities that had created economic opportunities through cooperative business development. A recent letter from a community in Detroit described how Elena's model had inspired residents to purchase and rehabilitate abandoned properties as permanently affordable housing for families returning to the city after years of displacement. The project had created construction jobs for neighborhood residents while providing homeownership opportunities for families who had been excluded from traditional mortgage markets. Another message from a rural community in Vermont explained how Elena's principles had guided their response to economic pressures that threatened family farms and local businesses. The community had created a land trust that preserved agricultural land while generating revenue to support rural enterprises and community services that maintained the area's economic viability and cultural character. The international expansion of Elena's principles had been facilitated by Linda's growing reputation as a speaker and consultant who could help communities adapt community land trust concepts to different legal and cultural contexts. Her presentations at conferences in Toronto, London, Melbourne, and Cape Town had generated partnerships with organizations working on similar challenges in communities facing displacement pressures from urban development, climate change, or economic transformation. Linda's most recent project involved working with Indigenous communities in Canada, who were using community land trust principles to assert greater control over housing development on reservation lands. The project was demonstrating how Elena's approach could support sovereignty goals while addressing practical housing needs that had been inadequately served by federal programs designed without meaningful community input. The personal relationship between Linda and me had continued to deepen alongside these professional developments, creating a marriage that felt both romantically fulfilling and practically effective for the work we'd both become passionate about. Our partnership had become a model for other couples involved in social change work, demonstrating how personal relationships could enhance rather than compete with professional commitments to community development. We'd recently purchased a second property on Maple Grove Avenue, converting it into a bed and breakfast that provided accommodations for researchers, practitioners, and students who came to study Elena's model while generating revenue to support ongoing institute activities. The bed and breakfast had become an informal gathering place for community development practitioners from around the world, creating opportunities for cross-cultural learning and collaboration that extended Elena's influence in directions she could never have imagined. The restoration work that had brought Linda and me together continued to play a role in our shared life. As we discovered that many communities applying Elena's principles needed technical assistance with building renovation, historical preservation, and adaptive reuse projects that supported their development goals. My handyman skills had evolved into expertise in heritage building restoration and sustainable renovation practices that preserved community assets while adapting them for contemporary use. The mirror that had started our entire journey had been permanently installed in the United Nations Human Settlements Program headquarters in Nairobi, serving as both an artifact and a symbol of how grassroots innovation could inform international development practice. The mirror's hidden compartment displayed reproductions of Elena's original documents, illustrating how historical research could reveal forgotten approaches to persistent challenges. Linda often used Elena's mirror during her presentations to international audiences, explaining how the restoration process had become a metaphor for community development work that required patience, skill, and respect for existing assets while making necessary improvements to serve contemporary needs. The mirror's transformation from damaged furniture to treasured artifact paralleled the transformation of neighborhoods that had successfully applied Elena's principles to achieve stability and prosperity while maintaining their distinctive character. But perhaps the most significant outcome of our work had been its impact on how communities understood their own capacity for creating positive change. The Elena Rossetti model had demonstrated that ordinary residents possessed extraordinary capabilities for innovation and leadership when they had access to appropriate tools, supportive relationships, and clear understanding of how their individual contributions connected to larger community goals. This understanding had inspired community development projects in contexts far removed from Elena's original work in Ohio. Urban communities in Brazil were using Elena's principles to organize favela residents around housing improvement and economic development projects. Rural communities in India were applying her approach to natural resource management and cooperative enterprise development. Refugee communities in Jordan were adapting her methods to create stability and opportunity in temporary settlements that had become permanent communities. The global reach of Elena's influence had been documented in a book that Linda and Tyler had co-authored, titled Hidden in Plain Sight: How One Woman's Vision Became a Movement for Community-Controlled Development. The book had been translated into 12 languages and was being used as a textbook in urban planning and community development programs at universities around the world. The book's success had led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting projects that took Linda to communities on every continent except Antarctica. Each project revealed new applications of Elena's principles while demonstrating the universality of human needs for housing security, social connection, and meaningful participation in decisions that affected community life. Tyler's documentary work had expanded to include these international applications of Elena's model, creating a film series that showed how communities in radically different contexts were using similar principles to address housing, economic, and social challenges. His most recent film followed communities in Kenya, Bangladesh, and Peru that had adapted Elena's approach to local conditions while maintaining focus on community control and resident empowerment. The film series had been acquired by educational distributors worldwide and was being used in classrooms from middle school through graduate level to teach students about community development, social entrepreneurship, and grassroots approaches to addressing global challenges. Tyler's work was establishing visual documentation as an essential tool for sharing community development innovations across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Sophie's technological contributions had evolved to include artificial intelligence, applications that could help communities identify successful development practices from other contexts that might be adaptable to their specific circumstances. Her digital tools were enabling communities to learn from each other across geographic and cultural boundaries, while maintaining focus on locally controlled development that reflected particular needs and preferences. David's academic program had graduated over 100 community development practitioners who were working in communities throughout the Americas, applying participatory planning methods that traced their origins to Elena's neighborhood development approach. The graduates maintained networks that facilitated ongoing learning and collaboration, creating informal systems for sharing innovations and supporting each other's work in challenging contexts. As I stood before the UN audience, preparing to share Elena's story with urban planners and housing advocates from around the world, I reflected on how Linda's question about attractiveness had catalyzed a journey that none of us could have anticipated. The question had been answered not just through Linda's personal transformation, but through the recognition that true attractiveness came from understanding your connection to larger purposes and committing to work that would benefit others long after your own lifetime. Elena's mirror continued to reflect clearly, showing visitors not just their own images, but the possibility of discovering hidden strengths, uncovering forgotten wisdom, and building communities that honored both individual dignity and collective well-being. Linda's question about 50-year-old bodies had revealed something profound about the connections between personal confidence, community involvement, and social change that had inspired a global movement for community-controlled development. The work continued every day, with new communities discovering Elena's principles, new applications being developed for different contexts, and new opportunities to demonstrate that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for creating positive change when they understood their connection to larger purposes and supported each other's growth and development. The mirror repair that had brought Linda and me together had become the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others discover their own capacity for building the communities they wanted to live in. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.